Hello. Yep. Hi, welcome everyone to this panel, Leaving No One Behind, How Data Can Be Used to Drive Inclusive Growth. My name is Arturo Franco. I work for the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, which is the social impact hub at MasterCard. And I'm very happy to have this conversation. Over the last 75 years, we have seen more than 1 billion people be lifted out of poverty, and we have seen an expansion of the global middle class. But if we move beyond those averages, we will find that the benefits of all of this economic growth and digital inclusion have not always been shared by everyone in society. And so we're going to talk about income inequality and wealth inequality and how it has very quickly moved from being just an economic phenomenon to a social problem, to a political problem that is shared equally by developing and developing countries, by cities like Buenos Aires that have 5 million, 10 million people in the wider region, by cities like New Orleans. We will hopefully be joined by someone from New Orleans that have about 1 million people, but also by smaller counties and cities. Inequality is a problem that is affecting us all, like Major Grant's home city. And so we're going to talk about inequality, and in particular, we want to emphasize a new form of inequality, which at the Center for Inclusive Growth we call information inequality. The gap that is growing between people who have access to new digital technologies and those who don't. And there is one example, which is the example of data. You know, the people who have access to data and the power of data science, and the people who don't have access to the data. If you have been following the discussion in Toronto around the Sidewalk Labs investment, you will understand how important that form of data inequality has been in that discussion. So we're very lucky today to have a great panel. I'm going to introduce people as I ask them questions, but hopefully we'll be able to touch not just on the problems of income, wealth inequality, information inequality, and data inequality, but also on the solutions and how actually data can be used as a mechanism to drive inclusive growth. So I'm gonna start with Patricio Zambrano Barragan, who is a housing and urban development specialist at the Inter-American Development Bank. And Patricio has been focusing on his work in one of the kind of most common characterizations of inequality in a city, which is informality. So Patricio, tell us a little bit about your work and how tech and data play in trying to solve a problem like informality in cities.
Thanks, Arturo. It's a great pleasure to be here. Can you hear me now? Hello? Good? Yep. I was saying thanks Arturo, thanks City Possible for having me. I work at the Inter-American Development Bank, so by way of context, if you don't know it, we're a development banking agency, so we do public sector lending for governments throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, but also technical assistance and grants, particularly at the subnational level. And I work specifically in the urban development group, so if you think about some of the loans and operations that we have historically, it's in our DNA to work with informality. One of the first loans was a housing loan, sites and services, neighborhood upgrading. And the question for us has been, even as we continue to work in these sort of classical sort of 1970s problems for us, is how to bring digital technologies and data to that. And one of the ways in which we're pioneering it, if you think of it as a sort of the data life cycle within urban development projects, the main entry point that we've had recently is the generation of information around informal settlements. And what we try to do is really not reinvent the wheel, but try to bring in tools that have been tested elsewhere and make them work for specific city agencies or specific communities. A couple of examples, we've tested machine learning techniques to do automatic building detection. But what we do with that, which is now becoming a much more common technique, we take that map and we load it into open source tools to work with communities to load the physical information.
Which you guys can see here on the screen.
Yeah, there should be some images over there. And you use that and you walk with communities and you help them with the app to bring in that information and load the map with actual real information about their settlements. Now, one important aspect that I want to touch on is that a recurrent problem that we have is that we may be able to implement solutions such as that, and we may be able to improve neighborhood conditions in the cities that we work, but we still not necessarily touching structural conditions around informality. So the other aspect of informality that we have there has less to do with just the spatial conditions, it has to do with, for example, labor markets. So much like, for example, the internet penetration in Latin America is 50%, to speak to your point earlier about data and technology inequality and that data divide. Similarly, about 50% of people in Latin America lack access to proper financing, banking systems, and very few of those have proper savings, for example. That doesn't mean that they're actively looking for solutions. In housing, what we see is a lot of self-construction and alternative ways of finding savings. So what we're trying to do there recently as well is we're trying to develop at the national level better regulatory frameworks so that fintech can provide solutions for underserved communities. So we're tying that up, that sort of spatial analysis, with the financial inclusion portion of it. So that's a couple of examples we can talk about more later.
Yeah, and I'm going to come back to you to talk about in a deeper level how tech and data can be part of the more structural solution as well, because I'm guessing that the barriers to formalizing both as a taxpayer or as a company in a city could be somewhat diminished if technology was applied or if better data management was applied. I'm going to introduce now Pablo Mlinkiewicz. Sorry. He's the director of data science of the city of Buenos Aires. As I mentioned before, the capital of Argentina, a massive city. And his department basically works to promote a more data-driven approach to managing that city. And so, Pablo, talk to us a little bit about kind of this issue, not just of informality, but of another type of exclusion, which is we know that small businesses have a harder time kind of growing and developing than larger businesses, particularly in our setting in Latin America. About 70% of small female-owned small businesses in developing countries have no access to credit, have no access to tools, to resources, and things like data, right?
Yes.
And so you're doing something really interesting called the Map of Commercial Opportunities. I'm going to pull it up here. But why don't you tell us a little bit about the work that you guys are doing with data?
Okay, thank you. Hello, thank you for inviting me. Thank you to my partners. I want to put a little bit of context about what we are doing in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. Buenos Aires has 3 million people living there and almost 3 million more visiting day by day. But when we make some research about how many people visit our city, some office say 3 million, some office say 1.5. So we are from the government. How many people are coming from the government or any local government?
Is there anyone that works in government here? City government?
Wow.
Just one? Okay, great.
So
welcome.
Welcome. So we start to understand that we have a lot of information and a lot of data, and we realize that there are so many small business entrepreneurs that they don't have any data to take decisions. So we start to take decisions with a lot of data, sometimes not the best one, but we start to do that, and try to put focus in become a data-driven city to take decisions. But what about the people who has no data or maybe don't have enough money to buy data to take decisions? So we put focus on that. In Argentina, we have many big companies to sell data or to sell research, big ones like maybe also here or maybe in the United States. But we all the time say the owner of the kiosk or the owner of a small vegetable store, he cannot sit on that table and ask for that data, because just drink a coffee with that big companies is quite expensive. But we have the data, and you can see now it's free, it's open. Also, you can download in the open portal. It's really easy. It's moc.buenosaires.gov.ar, and also you can switch in English. So you have a lot of information, and for example, the history of some part of the city or some small neighborhood, we use a kind of 400 meters, like it's a small part of the Buenos Aires city, and all the information of that place for more than 5 years we give to the citizen. For example, how many stores closed, which kind of stores closed in that time. Of course, all the information it's anonymized. You cannot see nothing about anyone. And if you have the chance to see something to some customer, we make an aggregation. And if you can't see, we make an aggregation again. So this information is for free now. All the people in Buenos Aires, also from outside of Buenos Aires, can look this, can use this a complementary way to take a decision. So that is I think is one of the most ambitious experience. And also, we say for Buenos Aires City is open a new way to think, because we start to put attention just in the businessman, but now we start to put attention in all the information that we are collecting to take decision into the government of Buenos Aires City. So that is our experience.
No, and and I'll come back to you to talk a little bit about what the impact has been for that kind of small business that now has access to this amazing data, and so how are you guys measuring the impact that this is having? Before I go to our only elected official on the stage, to Mayor Grant, I want to finish kind of the round with the experts, with the data providers, because our friend Eyal Feder from Sense City has an amazing data set. They actually use some of the most sophisticated tools like natural language processing, AI, all of these kind of fancy terms. Welcome, please, Kimberly. Thank you. And what they actually do is that they capture not just data of what's happening, coming from the census or coming from other kind of official objective databases. They actually listen to people, right? And so he's going to tell us a little bit about how inequality sounds like when you're listening to the city.
Sure. Well, Arturo, thank you for having me, and thank you to MasterCard and City Possible. I think that Pablo mentioned the power of data-driven decisions, and this is a lot of what I think all of this panel is about, the power of looking at data and making better decisions about it. And this is especially true when you think about local governments. As hopefully everybody in this room believes, local governments are very, very important organizations with a huge impact on everyday lives of their communities, and one of the biggest drivers of inclusive growth, right? They are at the helm of being able to lift up their communities, being able to reappropriate resources. And when thinking about that, when we want to use the local government's resources in a more inclusive way, one of the most interesting questions is how can we leverage data to do that? And when thinking about data being effective for inclusive growth, we need to ask ourselves, what data are we basing this on? And when we talk to mayors, city managers, elected officials across more than 100 local governments we're working with, we hear over and over again that they want to prioritize their investments based on one criteria first and foremost, the priorities of their community. What are the things that their community cares about the most, the things that they're satisfied with, unsatisfied with? That should be the main driver of their investment. And today, not all people in the community have a seat at the table voicing their priorities. One of the city managers we work with calls this the STP problem, the same 10 people that always show up to every city council meeting, every public hearing. And what we're doing as a company is we're trying to increase that intake funnel of opinions coming in to support our decision-making process. We basically look at data that's already out there. It can be from the city's customer service databases, like the call center where people report problems, 311 in the US. It can be from emails that they're getting, and it can be from data that's alive out there online, like social media. In an interesting way, today, posting something on Twitter or Facebook is probably the lowest barrier to entry to participate. This is the easiest thing for a lot of people to share their opinion without even thinking that they're talking to the city government specifically. They're talking to the world, sharing their feedback about the traffic or the park or their education system. And what we do is we bring in all of that data, and it could sum up to millions of data points in cities as big as Houston or Chicago that we work with. And then we use natural language processing to make sense out of it and really understand what the community cares about. And one very short example to show how that actually sounds in real life, with the city of Fort Lauderdale in Florida, a city of about 200,000 people, they were building a new initiative that was supposed to benefit the community a lot, a new sports center, basically training facilities for soccer. And like a lot of other major initiatives that the city is pushing, they sold off some land. There was a small group that was very objecting to that. They even sued the city, they sent letters to City Hall, and this initiative was about to be canceled because there was very strong objection showing up to every city council meeting. But our ability to show wide-scale data really helped this initiative come to life and benefit to the community. We showed them that on social media, over 70% of all comments were positive about this issue. And we're talking about over 100,000 comments. So unlike the few people that came to every city hall meeting and demonstrated, hundreds of thousands of people were happy about this thing happening, and this allowed the city to invest its resources in a place that really helped that more inclusive growth.
No, that's a great example, and if you could see the dashboards that Sen City produces, imagine being the mayor and having the ability almost in real time to listen in on the conversation that is going on in your city. And so just to Kim, thank you for coming and bring you up to speed. We've been talking about kind of private sector data that is kind of integrated and put out there as open source data for solving informality. We've been talking about the government's role in putting their own data out there in a way that those who are excluded, the smaller businesses, can actually have access to it. And we're talking about listening to a city. So let me turn to Mayor Grant, and I'll finish with you, Kim. But Mayor Grant, when you look at all of this in your ambition in Seat Pleasant and your drive to make it a smart city and to try to bring inclusion, how does the inequality issue play out, and how do you think about technology and data to solve perhaps a problem that you could also face, which is the STP problem, the same kind of 10 people showing up in your meetings?
Well, thank you so very much. Thanks City Possible for this opportunity, to my co-panelists as well, and to all of you who came to this presentation. I would tell you this is most exciting to hear my co-panelists and the great work that they're doing in their community, which can be replicated also in small cities as well. Data, 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 data. Critically important for us to be able to gather as much information as possible. All of those data is coming in for us to drive the decisions that we make on behalf of our residents. But what's also important is that the citizens, creating a citizen-centric government, is important that they also have access to that data as well, because that data helps them to be very instructive to us as to how they want their city to be governed. The residents should be empowered to give to their elected officials how they wish to be governed. But we want them to have accurate information. We want them to have information that's coming from various sources that can create a story, if you will, to help them give direction to us. If you don't do that, it makes it very difficult to be able to have a public discourse on the decisions that you're making in your city, because you're not utilizing the factual empirical data that exists there. Those individuals that come in and create disruptions at your city council meetings, we focus their attention on what the data says. Based upon that data, that is the decisions that we make. But we believe that smart cities is the new social justice platform for our communities, where you can create inclusion and equity for all segments of the society. It's important that everyone has the opportunity to have access to that data. As you say, a rising tide lifts all boats. Well, rising data lifts every member of the community, and that's what's most important for us, to ensure that every resident has access to information that they too can make decisions on their day-to-day lives.
Yeah, and I love the fact that thank you for that. Smart cities is a new social justice platform. I'm going to steal that one from you. I'm going to take it. And I'm going to come with Kimberly LaGrue, who's the Chief Information Officer of the City of New Orleans. It's a city that has been hit by both natural disasters and also some man-made disasters that left communities behind in the Claiborne Corridor and other parts of the city, but that is living through a very exciting transformation with very positive programs there. We actually, earlier this year, we partnered with a professor in the University of New Orleans, Michelle Thompson, who's a MasterCard Data Fellow. And we brought 60 data scientists from the company to do a 36-hour datathon. See how our aggregate transaction data, the spend data that we can aggregate and anonymize, allowed us to understand if the Claiborne Corridor, the Cultural District, the Innovation District, the Opportunity Zone incentive was working for New Orleans or it wasn't. It was a very eye-opening experience for me to go from the desktop to the city and actually look at these communities. Being in charge of technology, how do you see the role of technology and particularly data to guide the types of policies that are going to create this inclusion that we need in a city like New Orleans?
Thank you. So for us, we have to
El micrófono, por favor.
So for us, we have to make the data, we need to set the standards for how we open data, how we make data available, and then the access. So the equity conversation is always there, being inclusive, and making sure that data accurately represents the folk that we are trying to influence or we're trying to benefit. So for us, we had the kickstart, which was Hurricane Katrina. And we did things kind of in reverse, very typical of New Orleans, if you know anything about us. We actually had public engagement. We had citizen buy-in on using data for decision making because we had to rebuild the city. So they were concerned about blight, they were concerned about housing and making sure that those inequities were being addressed, that we were recovering in this neighborhood in the same way that we were recovering in this other neighborhood. So we learned to use data, and it took some of the sting off what information looked like coming from the government, right? They had to learn to trust us very early on. That put a tremendous burden on the city to be very responsible about the way that we use data. So we went to the next data set, which was our public safety data. Building on the trust that we had gotten from the community about recovery, we were able to open data sets about something else that the citizens cared about, and that was their safety. Recovering city, first you want to reduce risk, I need a place to live, and then I want to look at data that tells me I am safe. And some of it exposed our faults and our problems. And we used that data again to address those things. And then they wanted to know how we were progressing. Said, are we doing okay? And we went from there to looking at inequities in other areas. So the work that you all did shows us where economic disparities exist and then how we reduce them. Our information now, or what we do next steps, is we help our government make decisions. So providing dashboards to the mayor, letting her see areas where those inequalities exist and what we're going to do about them or how she can shape policy around them is very important. But even areas where we see a digital divide, really knowing, using data to show what that divide really looks like, quantifying it. For us, we know 60% of our low-income residents don't have access to data. And then we create programs, whether it is digital literacy to educate our citizens on how to do better or how to use digital resources, whether it is helping them get their devices in a condition to use those data points and to see them or to access them, or educating them on how data is important, right? They have to understand the relevancy of the data to them. So what we do is we listen to the priorities of our administration. We give them information that supplies a tool or a resource to help them make those decisions. And then we go out and we try to implement in the best way we can. But making sure our data is clean, it's accessible to everyone, and it's accurate is really what helps us use data for decision making in our city.
Great, thank you for that. It feels to me that the kind of the data responsibility approach that cities are taking around the world is very similar to what a company like MasterCard or others are trying to do out in the world. We know that data responsibility not just doesn't mean that we have to be, take care of privacy and safeguards of the data that we are given, but that part of that responsibility is also putting that data in the hands, in a responsible way, in the hands of people that can do social good with it, in the hands of people that can make decisions that lift all of those boats, as Mayor Grant was saying. And so I feel that we're in a transition moment where both the public sector and the private sector are trying to figure out how do we do more with data without, falling into this tech, everyone's bad kind of narrative and backlash. So I'm going to ask one more question to the panel, but Patricio, you look at a lot of countries, a lot of cities. You look at the IDB is really innovative in public-private partnerships. What is the role of the private sector in all of this, in making cities use better data to make better decisions that benefit everyone?
Sure. There's no. Can you hear me now? Yes? No. There's. I would tell you one positive and one a little bit more negative.
Levántate un poquito.
A ver. Is that better?
Yeah. Much better.
One that's a lot more positive, one that's a little bit more difficult. Perhaps my colleagues from the cities know about this one, but we have a sort of mediating role. We have a large footprint, and like I said before, we don't want to try to reinvent the wheel. We're not a technology company. So what we try to do is pilot first, test something out, test the tool that works well, and then make it cheaper. And by cheaper, I mean make it as open source as possible. I think I included in the slides, we have a regional platform called Code for Development. It's code.idb.org. We try to develop content not just in English for our Caribbean partners, but in Spanish, which seems to be lacking in this sector as well. So take that private alliance, that partnership. We have a partnership with MasterCard, in fact, in the Dominican Republic, where we do open source mapping of informal transit lines. We've taken that app, translated the solution into our Code for Development, and now we're going to go to Asunción in Paraguay and Cali, Colombia next year, for example. But the more difficult one, perhaps, is at a city level, we try to engage or support city officials in that kind of procurement discussion, particularly in the utility sector. At least in the public sector, for example, transport agencies or third-party vendors that handle the transit lines, water utilities, electricity utilities, they have precious, valuable information, and very few of the cities that we work in have any kind of provision where the data actually comes back, either to the citizens or the city themselves. So at the governance level, we're trying to do something that sounds really boring, which is procurement innovation. Really think through how they look at these contracts with data-rich entities that do public sector work, and figure out a way that data can come back and really power these data decisions that we have. And Buenos Aires has been a model in that respect in terms of the open government alliances that they have.
So I want to go to Buenos Aires, and maybe it's a question also if you guys want to pitch in, which is how do you think about creating that data culture in government? How do you work with the rest of the government? So that to ensure that they are also adapting the tools that you are creating, and you're not just like an appendix of the government. And also, perhaps, Eyal, you work with a lot of cities. So, how is this evolving at the city government, and what works to create that culture?
Yes, something that we need to change, or we are trying to change, is the mindset of the people who take decisions, the big ones. Sometimes these really high politicians, they don't want to have a discussion with the data.
Yeah.
To say in the easy way. Sometimes they say we will build the school here, and my role into the government is say why. It's like we have to return to my kids like 2-3 years old and start to say why many times. Because when you start to say why and why and why, they say, I really don't know where I have to open the school here, or maybe where I have to make a high road in this part or in this other part. So I think we have to try to change that mindset. It's quite difficult, but we are trying to do from inside, and we believe that you, or maybe both of you, you are doing from outside of the government. Also the companies, there are sometimes maybe the companies have a difficult way to approach that, but we need that some companies say why you are doing this, why, and sometimes I don't know, something happened in the mind and say, okay, maybe I have to think or rethink why I tweet that.
Kim, how are you doing it in New Orleans, creating a data culture in the city?
Starting with a problem-solving approach. You've got to look at the problems in the city.
Exactly.
So for me as a technologist and the chief nerd of the city of New Orleans is what I am.
She said it.
I said it, self-professed. I look at technology solutions and I appreciate the benefits of them, but for our administration, our mayor is very focused on inclusion and making sure that the priorities of creating a safe infrastructure for the residents is what we're looking for. That's her priority. So inclusive growth of our city is the problem. Looking for programs that help us solve those problems is where we find ourselves here, right? With cities who share common problems, like the ones that we have with people who have experience and who've understood those problems at the city level. It helps drive consensus with our citizens, and it gives the government an easier approach to implementing technology solutions.
Mayor Grant, we're running out of time. If you and your city officials and your citizens had access today to all of the tools that we've seen here today for free, what impact would that have in your city? How far could you go with that data?
Well, clearly there is no limitations at that point in time when you have access to all of that information. I would say that it is critically important that for those companies that are coming and talking to cities, that they put the city citizens as the priority. Yeah. What we do is all about our residents, and it's about our constituency. So when you're creating that citizen-centric government and you're creating a product that benefits everybody, the quality of life of every resident is improved.
Great. And finish with Ayal?
Yeah, so just to piggyback on the last two things the mayor and Kim mentioned, I think it's all about the value. Data in itself is not interesting.
That's right.
It's interesting only when it's in context, when it's in the context of a problem, and oftentimes in the context of a city, that is to define the priorities of the communities. And what we do, the approach we take, is we try within the first month of working with the city to make sure we have one clear story where the data was valuable to a real decision to support the priorities of the city. And once you give, when we talk about creating a data culture, when you give one example, you show someone that data was helpful to them in their process, they get hooked on it, and that starts creating that request for data in all the future cases. So that's, oftentimes, what we prioritize.
Great. Well, we unfortunately ran out of time, but I want to thank all of our panelists. This was a great panel. I learned a lot. I hope everyone here, thank you for coming. Hope you learned a lot. And what I take is smart cities are the new social justice platform. And we are creating a new way of doing inclusion, which is called smart inclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.